Welcome to the Triage Method podcast with me, Gary McGowan, and my co-host, Patrick Farrell. How are you this week, Paddy?
I am actually fantastic this week. This week I have coronavirus and literally no symptoms. I have the mildest of a cough. The only reason I know I have COVID is because I had to take a test when I came back from Paris. You know?
So it's making you feel even better than normal, is what you're saying.
No, it's actually making me incredibly bored because I have to sit at home.
Very good. Very good. I'm sick as well with a non-COVID illness, I believe. Maybe potentially related to the post-COVID period. That's what my student health doctor said. She was like, "Oh, it's probably a post-COVID illness because it seems like most people or a lot of people after COVID are getting, these colds and flu type mild illnesses a lot more frequently or whatever." But I don't know. I'm fine. We're all good. And this week we're going to be talking about health. So apologies for not showing up, either of us, in our optimal state of health, but we'll do our best to advise, and you can do as we say and not as we do. Try not to get COVID.
Well, actually, even though Gary said do as we advise, this is not medical advice. I don't know why he said that. Absolutely reckless, trying to get us sued. Oh my God, Gary. But yeah, no, this podcast, we're just going to be talking about our general kind of health practices, anything we do. Obviously, this is not going to be all encompassing. We're not going to be able to cover every single little thing that we do. But as we were talking about, how we kind of organize our training, how we're like, our goals and stuff with, the training side of things, thought it was a natural kind of conclusion to go into what we're doing to manage our health. Because yeah, okay, both myself and Gary really enjoy the training side of things. We really enjoy looking a certain way, feeling a certain way, being a certain athleticness, whatever, right? But both of us care about our health. Our business is not necessarily just a business about body composition change. Like, yeah, that's part of it for some people, but a lot of the stuff that we work on with our clients is improving their health. And that might be just a natural byproduct of the training process, the improved nutrition, etc. But it also might be an actual goal that we're working towards, in terms of someone might come to us and they have elevated like blood lipids or high cholesterol or whatever it is, and we're like, okay, how can we potentially move them in a direction or support them in whatever their doctor is saying to do with managing their high cholesterol. So we wanted to cover the kind of things that we're looking out for in terms of improving our health or preventing future issues. Now, the unfortunate thing, or fortunate, depending on how you look at it, about this world is that it is fucking chaotic, right? So we could do everything within our power. And it's the same for you listening to this. You could do everything within your power, do it all completely right, and still get fucked, right? And this is unfortunate on many levels. Like you always hear of people being like, oh, like this, single mother of five, never smoked a day in her life, and she got fucking lung cancer. And you're like, that's just, unlucky, so that always happens. But having said that, there are clearly things that we can do to better protect ourselves. Okay. So to be able to better protect ourselves, we have to know what we're trying to protect ourselves against, right? We have to effectively know your enemy, right? And in the terms of what we're trying to do here, there is a bit of a dichotomy, right? Because we're not necessarily just trying to, live a long life, right? Obviously, that's a goal. I don't think I know anyone that is like, yeah, no, actually, I just 25, I'm done. I just want to live to 25. Most people are going, I want to see, can I live a long life, right? But most people also would like to live, like actually have life to those years. They don't want to just drag out the last 20 years of their life or 30 years of their life and basically be able to do nothing. They just have to sit in a chair. Most people don't really want that. They want to live long, but they also want to have life to those years, right? So that brings us to a little bit of a dichotomy, because the things that we do to really improve our quality of life aren't necessarily the same things that we do to improve the quantity of life, right? There is a little or a lot of overlap, but we do have to keep that in mind, right? But as I was saying, we have to know our enemy in terms of what we're actually fighting against, right? And a lot of the time, this this kind of conversation gets bogged down into a discussion of like, what is health? You know, because you see like different organizations, they might have a definition of health that is like, oh, it's the absence of disease, right? And I think most people, you know, reading that or listening to that or hearing that or whatever, they're not thinking like, oh yeah, I would consider someone healthy if they just didn't have disease, right? They didn't have some sort of dis-ease, right? That's not how most people think of health. Most people are thinking of health, they're thinking like, I want to feel like this kind of vitality, right? So while we are obviously going to focus here today on, you know, different disease processes and how we're preventing or protecting against those, or hopefully protecting or preventing those, it isn't actually all encompassing. Like that's not everything that we're doing. Like we're probably not going to talk about like, you know, being part of a community here today. We're not going to talk about like our social support, our like, you know, psychological well-being. Obviously that's, you know, a huge part of all of this stuff, but it's kind of beyond the scope of what we're talking about here, or at least, you know, the podcast would end up being like 12 hours long if we're to talk about everything, right? But having said all that, before we get stuck into the kind of top causes of death, Gary, do you have anything to say?
No, I don't think so. Let's just go through the top causes of death and then we can go from there because it'll make more sense.
Yeah, fantastic. Right. Now, these are not rank ordered. And the reason they're not rank ordered is because they actually do change depending on where you are in terms of your actual age, right? And obviously, age is just a proxy for the behaviors you engage in. Like a 70-year-old versus an 18-year-old, they're probably engaging in different behaviors. And for example, and I'll give this because it's obviously relevant to myself and Gary, like when you're younger, the two leading causes of death are transport injuries and interpersonal injuries, right? So even though we're talking about, and we will be talking about like heart disease risk and stuff like that, like unfortunately, or fortunately, again, depending on how you look at it, like that stuff, you know, you lay the foundations of that stuff in your, you know, earlier years, and then you reap what you sow in your later years, right? But unfortunately, that means that you can get away with a lot of bad habits, a lot of bad practices in your early years, and they don't have an immediate consequence. Unlike, you know, if you're just, I don't know, not wearing your seatbelt or driving recklessly, you know, transport injuries are the thing that's going to get you, and it's going to be more immediate, right? So transport injuries and interpersonal injuries are, you know, the two biggest killers by, you know, percentage in terms of the age for people. I think it's below 40. So bear that in mind, right? And obviously, again, you can do stuff to prevent that. You know, wear your seatbelt, drive safely. I don't know, for interpersonal injuries, just, I don't know, don't get into fights or learn how to fight so that you don't become a statistic. But other than that, look, there's not a huge amount we can talk about with that kind of stuff, right? And obviously, again, there is unfortunately that chaos that we talked about where you could just be the random victim of crime or the random victim of a wayward car or whatever, right? But outside of that, again, these are no like rank ordered or whatever. However, I am going to put heart disease first, and there's a few different like subcategories of that because, you know, based on the entire population, this is pretty much the biggest killer, right? So we have to kind of pay our dues here and look at that, right? So heart disease, like there's ischemia, there's stroke, there's chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, hypertensive, like this, you know, encompasses all the stuff that you can be thinking about in terms of heart disease, right? So that's the big killer, right? That's the main killer. We have stuff within our power to look at that, right? To hopefully prevent that, right, happening, you know, the different subcategories as well. The next thing is trachea, bronchus, lung cancers, right? 75% or thereabouts, I got a few different statistics with this, are related to smoking, right? So again, we have something within our power to potentially help with, you know, preventing this. Don't smoke. Now, again, there's that chaos we talked about. If only 75% of this is related to smoking, that means that 25% of it is not related to smoking, right? And that could be other things. I don't know. I didn't break it down into like, you know, maybe it's, I don't know, car exhaust fumes or something that's getting you. But either way, that is something to look at, these various cancers of the like trachea, bronchus, lung, right, whatever, right? The other thing, and again, this potentially doesn't apply as much to the Western world, we'll say, although, you know, Gary, maybe you have a different opinion on this. It's lower respiratory infections, right? That's something to be aware of. And again, you could say that's in our control. It's a lot of not in our control as well. but again, we'll get back to that. Diabetes, and obviously this is becoming a bigger killer, especially in the Western world, and we'll call it like, metabolic health related diseases in general. This is again something that's within our control to an extent. Obviously, if you have a type 1 diabetes or something, it's not as much in your control. The other big killers are Alzheimer's disease and other dementias. And unfortunately, this affects women more than men. And again, there are some things that are in our control with that, but unfortunately, a lot of that stuff, not really in our control, right? Stomach cancer is another big one. And again, that is a little bit more in developing nations in terms of, a lot of it is to do with like salt and stuff in the diet, but again, we can come back to that, right? And then there's colon and rectum cancers, and then there's also kidney disease. So those are the kind of big killers. So you can see that there's kind of a large, swathe of things that are being affected that end up killing people, right? So Gary, what are your thoughts? Where do we even start with that?
The thing is, the advice that one would give if one were to offer medical advice or nutrition advice or lifestyle advice in relation to the vast majority of those diseases can actually come back to a few very, very simple behaviors. And they're the things that we summarize all the time, don't smoke, don't drink or minimize alcohol consumption, make sure you're getting enough sleep, make sure that you're eating plenty of fruits and vegetables, try to limit your saturated fat intake, eat plenty of fiber, eat plenty of protein, and, manage your body weight. And as a result of that, obviously your calorie intake over time. And if you do all those things while exercising regularly and doing all the other good lifestyle things, you'll be doing as much as you can probably to minimize your risk of all of those respective diseases. And, people like to have specific prescriptive advice for each respective condition. But the thing is, if you actually look at them, there's huge crossover. Because if you look at, for example, renal or kidney disease, often there's a strong link there with risk factors for cardiovascular disease, such as through hypertension, so high blood pressure, or through high blood glucose, for example, if someone's got uncontrolled diabetes. So you can see that these things start to link together. So it's very difficult to kind of parse out what you would do for risk of one condition versus risk of another condition. Now, with that said, there's obviously more potent risk factors for each respective condition or cause of death, such as in the case of stroke, like high blood pressure is just really, really important. So if you can manage blood pressure, reducing salt intake in particular in the diet, that's a very potent pathway to address there. Whereas with diabetes, for example, the primary thing that you can do to reduce your risk of type 2 diabetes is to manage your body weight and ensure that you're not gaining excess body fat over time. Like that's probably the biggest modifiable thing there. And it effectively the only way that has been demonstrated to reverse type 2 diabetes or put it into remission is the loss of body weight because of mechanisms that we've discussed in the obesity series previously. So you can see that there's individual pathways that you might want to target more than others. But at the same time, we obviously want to consider all of these conditions together and the risk of all these conditions together, because what we really care about is all-cause mortality. We care about, like, I don't want to save myself from stroke risk if it's going to lead me to die from a heart attack. That doesn't make a difference to me. The good thing is there's huge crossover, and if you take care of everything, you're probably reducing your risk as much as you can. So that's the kind of the starting point there.
Yeah, 100%. There's basically healthy habits and unhealthy habits, right? And it makes sense that if you minimize your unhealthy habits, it kind of improves your health in general through a variety of mechanisms, depending on obviously what exactly we're talking about. For example, you were talking about blood pressure there, and you're like, okay, one of the interventions we could potentially do here is lower our salt, right? Our sodium intake. Now that has a knock-on effect of also affecting stuff like, potentially the kidneys, right? And you're like, okay, well, I was doing it for stroke risk, and now it's, lowered my kidney disease risk. It's also lowered my stomach cancer disease risk, right? And then I'm maybe swapping out food sources because, I'm normally eating, packaged food. Now I'm swapping out food sources to have, more fresh fruit and veg as a result of that. Because I wanted to get, more potassium in the diet. And now all of a sudden you're eating more fiber and, your metabolic health is now improving. And then also your, colorectal cancer risk is, going down because, now you're eating more fiber, right? So there are all these different like knock-on effects by making small changes. And this is one of those things where, again, it kind of comes back to laying the foundation of just good, healthy habits. And all of a sudden you're protecting yourself against, or, potentially preventing a variety of things, right? So I suppose before we get into just kind of any specifics in terms of what we're trying to do with, our health, it makes sense to just go through like the fundamentals. Like, what are we actually doing, right? So we have control over a few things, right? We have control over training, right? Obviously, to whatever extent you have control over your own training, you have control over your training, right? Now, obviously, you have to make time for that. Work commitments, family commitments, whatever that can potentially pose a barrier. But for the vast majority of people, they can get 2 to 3 training sessions done a week, right? That's 2 to 3 hours out of your week. Most people can do that, even if it's stuff, just in the house, right? Most people can find 2 to 3 hours to get something done, right? Now, we could obviously, jazz it up and be like, right, this is the guidelines, the recommendations for exercise. It would be, beneficial to at least hit those. However, again, that's not always possible, right? But we have control over training. We have more control over our diet. And again, there are obviously barriers to that. And again, we've talked about them previously on different shows, different episodes, I should say, in terms of socioeconomic status, the food environment you find yourself in your local area, whatever, right? But we have some control over our diet. We can still make better decisions, better swaps, so that we have improved health, right? So we have control over training, control over our diet. We have some control over our recovery, in terms of we can focus on getting enough sleep, right? Most often than not, you can try to get that. Now, obviously, if you're working 3 jobs, it's not exactly within your control, but you still have a lot of control over that. Stress management then as well, we have some control over that as well. It's not as controllable as, say, training, but we do have some practices that we can engage in to move the stress whatever cycle in a better way, right? So I suppose in this episode we're going to focus mostly on the nutrition and general health practices we do, because we've already talked about training, right? So I'm going to take it as a foundation, a given, that you guys know that we are training, right? Because again, we're talking about this from our perspective, what we're doing, and so you guys know that we're training, right? We're both training 4 to 10 times per week, right? So again, that's our perspective. Now, do we think that everyone needs to be training 4 to 10 times per week? Yeah, probably not. I would be pretty happy if someone said to me that I'm training 2 to 3 times per week. I'd be like, cool, you're at least hitting your like foundational like health related goals, maybe layer on some walking on top of that. Boom, happy days, right? So do you have anything to say just to kind of summarize training, perhaps, Gary? And is there anything that you're like, right, if we're really focused on that? I suppose we should dive a little bit deeper in terms of, aerobic health is probably beneficial for heart disease and stuff like that. But do you have anything to say on training?
Yeah, let me just touch on something that kind of encompasses both of the points that you've mentioned. And that is that when you're considering both lifespan and health span, which we might summarize as being the amount of your life that you're actually healthy and functional for, because obviously what we're trying to do is prolong that health span where we're living a decent quality of life. We don't just want to prolong our lifespan if we're, shriveled up in bed, just about being kept alive on loads of different drugs. That's clearly not a great quality of life. But in order to preserve that health span as much as possible, what we're actually trying to do is find this kind of balance between anabolic processes and catabolic processes. Okay. And the reason this is really important is because each of those respective directions can exploit pathways that are potentially reducing your risk of disease long term. So for example, if you're in a very anabolic state, all right, so let's say you're taking loads of anabolic drugs, you're eating loads and loads of food, you're training, lifting all the weights, all that sort of stuff, you're getting the benefits of having extra muscle mass, extra strength, extra bone mass, which we know are super, super important for preserving function into later life, reducing risk of fracture later in life, giving you more of a physiological reserve for periods of illness. For example, if you have one of those lower respiratory tract infections and you're hospitalized for 2 weeks in your 80s, if you've got 20 kilos of body of muscle and fat to spare, then that's not as big of a deal to you as it is to someone who's already super lean and skinny and frail, who's at risk of dying from that hospitalization. So you can see that there's a huge benefit to those anabolic processes. And we certainly don't want to be dieting forever, and we don't want to be as skinny as we possibly can later into life. However, on the other side of things, catabolic processes are very, very important. Okay. And we need to be having those catabolic processes take place in our bodies if we want to reduce our risk of disease. An example of that would be cancer is effectively a chaotic anabolic state. It's basically like you turn off or inactivate the off switch and growth just continues, like a runaway train. That's effectively what happens. And that can happen for so many different reasons, such as the switching on or off of particular genes, or just exposure to a chronic anabolic state. That's one of the reasons why if someone's, constantly overeating over time, or eating or consuming lots of anabolic drugs, you get an increase in these risks of certain cancers. So that's effectively what it is a runaway anabolic state. And exposure to that catabolic state through caloric restriction or fasting or something like that, that can address some of those factors that could potentially reduce one's risk of cancer over time. However, we might look at that and say, okay, if caloric restriction reduces risk of cancer, then maybe we should just be in a calorie deficit forever. But the problem with that is that you then run into the issue of, well, I'm going to run out of body mass eventually. What are you going to do? Diet forever? Be weak and frail and, be in bed taking anti-cancer drugs and fasting, but have no quality of life? Like, clearly, again, that's not a great thing. And obviously,
just imagine, again, a very easy way to think about that is you see these bodybuilders who are absolutely shredded on stage. They're not saying that, oh, the last few weeks, they're the most enjoyable weeks of their life. They're like, I feel cold. I have no vitality. I don't want to have sex. I don't want to do all of this stuff. And do you think that's how you want to live the next 40 years of your life? Yeah, probably not.
No, not at all. So, and obviously on each of those respective sides of the spectrum, there's other things related to health too. Whereas, if you're exposing yourself to that catabolic state where, let's say, periodical caloric restriction, where you're in a deficit for a period of time to manage your body weight, obviously you're reducing risk of obesity and obesity related chronic disease, such as diabetes, subsequent cardiovascular disease risk, etc., etc. So on both sides of the spectrum, there's a benefit to be gotten, and you want that to be able to preserve your health span. You want to be able to have enough muscle, have enough bone mass, have enough strength, etc. But you also want to ensure that you're not taking that to such an extreme that you're running into cumulative risk on that anabolic side. So that's the reason why we can't just, say that we're going to take drugs that switch off all the anabolic pathways. Okay, that would be such a simple approach. Unfortunately, it doesn't work. We also can't take drugs that are just going to cause us to grow and be super strong forever and expect no cumulative risk, because again, there's trade-offs there. So it's like this fine balance where we want a bit of both. And some people are going to be willing to accept the trade-offs of one over the other. For example, if you're a bodybuilder, you're clearly leaning in the direction of that anabolic side of the spectrum. And you'll see some people in the kind of functional medicine type world where they'll stay super lean and they'll be really fond of fasting and all this sort of stuff. But you look at them and you say, you know what, you actually look pretty frail, when you're weak, that's not going to serve you too well until later life. So they're maybe leaning more towards that side of the spectrum. So for most of us, we want to take the best of both worlds and try to live somewhere in the middle while dipping in more into one and more into the other at different periods of time. Now, with that said, exercise also kind of feeds into that, where exercise obviously has the benefits of the anabolic, but it also to some degree has the benefits of the catabolic, because there's some degree of a crossover between the metabolic pathways that will be activated by fasting or caloric restriction, for example, and those that will be activated by, for example, aerobic exercise. So there's a bit of a crossover there. One way to reduce your resting heart rate would be to fast. You're typically going to reduce your resting heart rate. Another way would be to exercise and get really fit and efficient. Okay, so there's another benefit there. Similarly, if you want more mitochondria, for example, mitochondrial biogenesis, the process of, increasing your mitochondrial density and size. One of the things you can do is caloric restriction, or you can exercise. So you get those benefits again from exercise too. And that's one of the reasons why exercise is such a potent longevity drug, and the good thing there is that the aerobic side of the spectrum, you're probably exploiting a little bit more of the catabolic side. And then with resistance training, you're probably exploiting a little bit more of the anabolic side. So it's a nice kind of mix between the two. Now, obviously, aerobic exercise, it supersedes just that reductionist discussion of the anabolic and the catabolic, because clearly that's just illustrative and it's a lot more complex in practice. And aerobic exercise is also giving you the benefit of strengthening your heart and making your heart more efficient in specific ways. The adaptations to exercise in the heart are quite specific to resistance training versus aerobic training. There's some crossover, but as we've discussed before, with aerobic training, you're generally getting a bit more of a left ventricular kind of eccentric hypertrophy pattern. It makes the heart more efficient. It improves your ability to pump blood out of the heart with each beat. And as you improve that aerobic fitness, it reduces your risk of things like high blood pressure long-term, of sustaining a heart attack, etc. Okay, there's many different parameters that it can affect, but all of them tend to be beneficial for health. So you definitely want to improve your aerobic fitness if you want to reduce your risk of dying of any cause effectively. So yeah, there's not too much else to say about that really, other than the specifics of the exercise physiology, but yeah, you definitely want to be training.
Yeah, like we've covered this before. I didn't want to get too bogged down in terms of the training, but basically training is good for health. We've talked about it before. We don't need to go into it too much. If you care to, go into the exact adaptations and stuff, like we have done specific cardiovascular training episodes. We've also just spent however long talking about training in general. So you should be able to, get a glimpse into like what benefits you're going to get from resistance training versus cardiovascular training, et cetera, right? So training, it's a foundation. We're going to be engaging in that process. Again, ideally 3 to 4 times per week, you get that done, happy days. A mix of some sort of resistance training. Again, it could be body weight stuff. Obviously, you're going to have to progress that at some stage, but could be some body weight stuff. And then some sort of cardiovascular training that could be, again, anaerobic training or aerobic training. We're obviously advocates of a bit of a mix, unless you're obviously trying to be some like specialist in whatever, I don't know, running or whatever. You're going to have to do more specialized work, but just a general health practice. You want to do some aerobic training, you want to do some anaerobic training, you want to do some resistance training. That's going to cover your bases in terms of health in general, in a variety of domains. Obviously, in terms of the metabolic health stuff, you're exercising, you're using all of the stuff that we've talked about, in terms of the cardiovascular risk, again, beneficial there, but also in terms of, strengthening the body for, potential wear and tear in the future, making you more resilient to the stresses of life. And ideally, you're building some muscles so that, again, in your older age, you have that bit of a muscle reserve, a bit of that strength reserve. So again, you have both more years to your life, but also more life to your years, right? So fantastic. That's the training side covered, right? There are obviously other things that we can do. A lot of the stuff that we can do in terms of impacting our health is related to the diet, right? And that is because 1 in 5 deaths are related to poor diet, right? And that obviously encompasses the developing world as well, which, that's unfortunately a lot to do with a lack of quality nutrition, a lack of nutrition in general. But then also, this is not just a problem of the developing world, it's a problem of the developed world in terms of basically the opposite end of the spectrum, in terms of a lot of people are dying from diseases related to overconsumption, right? So our dietary approach has to take that into account. We basically want to eat a calorie sufficient diet, or a calorie appropriate diet is what we often say. And that obviously is dependent on your specific goals. Generally speaking, it's probably going to be somewhat cyclical in terms of your calorie intake. There's going to be periods of time where, you're in a bit of a deficit. There's going to be periods of time where you're at maintenance. There's going to be periods of time where you're eating in a surplus. We basically want, if we were just purely focused on health, we probably want to eat a really good foundational diet and then just, barely tweak the calories depending on our exact goals and also our exact, situation, right? So what I mean by that is, for example, if you are someone that needs to lose a little bit of weight, we're probably not going into this like huge crash diet unless obviously, it's medically advised. Like, you could go on like an 800 calorie diet to get better, like, liver function, pancreas function, whatever, right? But in general, we probably just want to, create a diet that we can see ourselves doing for the rest of our lives, right? And that obviously wants to include, or should include, a few foundational dietary habits in terms of eating enough fruit and veg. And you can start at that, generic 5 a day. That's fantastic. You're at least getting some of your fruit and veg in. But we would probably be advocates of eating more fruit and veg than that, right? And that covers a lot of your bases in terms of, first of all, you're getting a lot more antioxidants in the diet, which are great for a variety of health issues. But also you're getting more fiber in the diet, which is great for, like, colorectal cancer. It's great for, blood sugar management, we could say. It's great for, again, a variety of things in the diet. It's also great for heart disease risk because fiber potentially, depending on the type of fiber it is, etc., potentially lowers cholesterol levels in the body. So happy days. We've just affected a few different pathways that could potentially kill us, right? So we've positively affected them, I should say. Then also, on top of eating, fruit and veg, we want to eat, again, sufficient protein. That's going to help us with our muscle building goals, our strength building goals, our general health goals. What else would you say in terms of like main key habits with the diet? Again, we've got calorie appropriateness, eating enough fiber, eating enough protein. The next thing I would probably say is just, keeping saturated fat below 15%. Like, ideally, if we're talking like general population, we would say 10%. But, if you're exercising, if you are eating enough fiber, you probably do have a little bit of leeway with that. However, the general recommendations would be below 10%. So again, if we're talking population wide, as this episode kind of is, I'm going to say 10%. What else would we do with the diet, Gary, to potentially, just cover all our bases?
Did you mention salt?
I didn't mention sauce, no.
Yes. So sauce or salt?
Salts.
Yeah, and sauce. Salt, yeah, is definitely a big one. Particularly, like, if you look at certain populations, particularly Asian populations, where they have extremely high salt intake, you do see a very significant risk of gastric cancer or stomach cancer. So that's a fairly big thing. It's very difficult, to be fair, for people to be consuming like a massive excess of salt to the extent seen in some of those populations. But if you're eating lots of processed foods, you'd be surprised how much salt you can actually rack up. So salt is definitely something that is worth trying to reduce in the diet. The good thing is, like, we don't have to end up speaking to our clients very frequently about this if they're already eating a diet that's primarily whole foods. If you're following the other guidelines where you're eating whole grains, you're cooking your potatoes, you're cooking rice, you're having, fruits and vegetables, lean meats, etc. If you're doing all that and you're not adding loads of salt at mealtime, you're probably fine. The real issue with salt tends to be that the vast majority in the developed world tends to be added, or not added, but come through processed foods. So, for example, if you get a sandwich in the shop, if you were having that sandwich at home, it might have had, half a gram to a gram of salt. Whereas if you're getting it in the shop, in Tesco or whatever, a prepackaged sandwich, you could be getting 3 grams plus of salt. And that's really taking up a large proportion of your daily intake / limit. And that can lead to quite a high salt intake over time. Other things that would add to that very easily would be things like eating crisps, for example, or bags of popcorn, things that even might seem fairly appropriate from a calorie perspective, but are really racking up your salt intake over time. So even if you just had, a bag of crisps or a bag of popcorn that's 100 to 150 calories or something like that, doesn't seem like a lot, but it could have a couple of grams of salt that could very easily push you over your targets for the day. So gastric cancer is one that's generally at higher salt intakes, but blood pressure can also be significantly affected by salt intake, and that can then lead to things like heart failure or stroke risk, which are definitely worth trying to avoid if you're trying to maximize your longevity. So the biggest thing there for me anyway is eat a whole food diet, follow the general guidelines surrounding a healthy diet and you'll be fine. If you are eating on the go a lot, do have a look at the packaging, just see what the salt intake is like. But I find that most people can control this pretty well by eating mostly food that they're cooking themselves, not adding too much salt. To be honest, if you're an athlete and you're eating a primarily whole foods diet, it's no big deal adding salt to your meals. Sometimes you might even need it to enhance your performance. And there's some difference there in terms of how much salt people lose through sweat as well. And that's actually one of the benefits of exercise, is that you lose salt through your sweat. So that can actually, be a beneficial thing. You don't want to replace it all or overcompensate if you're trying to exercise just for health. But yeah, they'd be some guidelines on salt anyway.
Yeah, not further to that, like we do also have to consider like potassium and magnesium.
Sure. Yeah.
Again, these are kind of taken care of if you're eating a whole food diet. Like if you're not eating a whole food diet, like the requirements for like potassium, I think it's like 15 grams in like ancestral populations. Now, I don't think the actual recommendations in this day and age are 15 grams. I actually couldn't tell you off the top of my head, but we're still not consuming enough potassium, especially by comparison to the amount of sodium that's being consumed, right? But on top of that, magnesium is also something that people are not eating enough of. However, you actually don't have to focus on this too much if you're just eating like real food. Like you get a lot of magnesium from like green leafy vegetables in general. Same with potassium, you're getting a lot of it from vegetables, especially if you're eating like, tubers and stuff like that, like potatoes, that kind of stuff, squashes, whatever. So again, if you just eat a quote unquote real diet, like a lot of this stuff is just looked after, right? And one of the things I do want to say is a lot of people get lost in the weeds with this stuff, and they're really hyper focused on like reducing their salt intake, and then all of a sudden they're somewhat deficient in it because they're exercising. They don't realize that, again, like I said, you do lose some salt in your sweat, right? Like I've had a few clients, especially vegetarian clients, who end up finding that they're cramping up more often, finding that they just don't have that kind of drive anymore because they're not eating enough salt, right? And you just get them to salt a little bit of their food, all of a sudden, boom, they feel great again. One of the other things we have to consider with that is, and it's a little bit less, it's a little bit more important in Europe versus America, is that America has like iodinized salt. A lot of European countries, I think the only European country is Switzerland that iodinized their salt. A lot of Europeans are just deficient in iodine, right? Because we also don't eat a lot of, again, depending on exactly where in Europe we're talking about, we don't eat a lot of like seafood products, right? So a lot of people can be deficient in iodine, which then leads to, thyroid issues, right? So again, that's just a little extra further thing. But if you're just cutting out salt completely, and especially if it's not iodinized salt, then all of a sudden you're losing a source of iodine. Now, I would probably be more of an advocate of just eating more seafood, eating some like, seaweeds and stuff, like, you get like sushi and stuff. I know, Gary, you don't like sushi, but you eat sushi, you get some seaweed, boom, you have some iodine, fantastic, happy days, right? But again, we just want to eat a generally well-balanced diet, and a lot of this stuff gets looked after, right? And there is another thing now that I'm just talking about seafood as well, as omega-3s, especially marine-derived omega-3s, are really important for health, and the vast majority of people just do not get enough. The vast majority of people just do not eat enough fish in general. So that is something that we should, ideally be eating, fatty fish 2, maybe 3 times per week. And if you're not able to do that because you don't like the taste, or you don't have the skills to be able to, cook that, or you don't want to cook that, or whatever, then probably we need to supplement with some sort of fish oil, right? Or you could say, if you want to get some like algal derived fish oil, you can get whatever that stuff is called. What is it called? The non-fish oil stuff, plankton, whatever the fuck it's called. You can get those kind of fish oils, or fish oils, omega-3s, I should say, as well. So you have options with that. Now, again, that's something that I would consider a general health practice. Like I supplement with some fish oil every single day. Like I'm trying to get like 3 to 5 grams of fish oil, or omega-3s, I should say, every single day. And there's a few things that are beneficial with that. The DHA is really beneficial for like brain health and brain development. Now, I actually don't know in terms of how beneficial this is in terms of a general population person. It is very beneficial for children and infants to consume enough DHA because their brain is still developing. But in terms of when you're already developed, like let's say for you're 25 and above, like your brain is probably as developed as it's going to get, right? So it's probably less important, the DHA component. It's probably more important as you age in terms of preventing cognitive decline. So we could say maybe we want to keep it topped up to at least a certain level. But But EPA is regardless of your life stage, that is really beneficial. And it's especially really beneficial for helping with heart disease risk in terms of like lowering triglycerides, in terms of helping with a better like overall cholesterol balance. So even if you don't get enough DHA throughout your general adult life, I'm a little bit less concerned about that. But if you're not getting enough EPA, I'd be like, okay, well, we have actually an increased risk of cardiovascular disease in this population then, because they're not getting the beneficial fish oil here, or omega-3 here, I should say, because you can get it from other places than fish. So do you have any thoughts on that, Gary?
Yeah, I think that's important. I think that personally I probably have salmon like definitely once a week, maybe twice a week some weeks. But I still supplement, because I'm not a big seafood guy, to be honest. And I think even like cooking methods, the source of your fish and everything, where does it come from? That can all contribute to variance in how much of the omega-3s you're getting from your fish intake. So while you should consume fish, oily fish in particular, for health, and I would encourage someone to probably consume more than I do. Like if I enjoyed sushi, like I would eat it more often, because there's additional benefits to be gotten there. But I supplement, so I have omega-3s that I just keep in the fridge, and I think I take 3 to 5 depending on how many other pills I'm taking in the morning, so I'll take something like that. And just a note there as well, you kind of mentioned it already, but if I'm taking 3 to 5 pills, that's 3 to 5 grams of fish oil. But then there's the specific omega-3s that I'm actually looking at as well. So if you're looking at supplements, just look for one that has a higher quantity, because sometimes what you'll see is you're taking 5 grams of fish oil, but you might only be getting 500 milligrams of combined EPA and DHA, because they're just filling the rest with filler, so the quality does
important as well, because there's different types of fish oil that potentially are beneficial for health, and other ones that are just kind of less beneficial for health. Krill oil was what the one I was trying to say earlier on. I couldn't remember. It was like plankton or whatever. But krill oil, well, it is actually in phospholipid form. You'd have to take fucking grams of that shit to be able to get enough EPA or DHA to actually have a beneficial effect. So while it is more, we'll call it absorbable, and it gets into the tissues and stuff like in a kind of more beneficial way, like you have to end up spending fucking so much money to be able to get an effective dose of that. It's the same with people are like, oh, well, I want to get this like ethanol form of it. Like, it's actually less important, right? Because we actually just want to get an effective dose. I would actually go on to something like labdoor.com, because they actually have like the ranking of different fish oil brands, and you can see what is actually in the pill versus what they claim to be in the pill. That's an important thing to know. But then also in terms of like the actual quality of it, because fish oil can be oxidized, and unfortunately a lot of these ones, which is not great, a lot of these ones that you're like, oh, this is a great dose of it, it's actually just fucking oxidized, which is not what you want, right? So you have to kind of play off the risk to reward the benefit stuff, because I don't think oxidized fish oil is going to be beneficial for health. And actually, in actual fact, I think it would probably be negative towards your health. So I would be looking to spend a little bit more money on getting a good fish oil brand. Again, go onto labdoor.com, and you can find the different brands, and you can be like, okay, well, what am I getting versus what they say they're giving me on the label, and then find that kind of risk to reward for you in terms of, okay, this one costs too much, it's outside of your budget, you're not willing to spend that every single day, whereas this one is a little bit less, a little bit lower quality, but it's inside your budget, fine, right? You just have to kind of play off that risk to reward benefit. There are some brands out there that are actually really, really fucking good in terms of like they'll have like a specific EPA only. You can get literally just the subfraction of EPA in triglyceride form, which is probably the form that I would recommend, even though I know everyone is like, oh, we'll get this like ethanol form and everything. I'm like, look, that's more easily oxidized both outside the body and inside the body. I'd rather just have it in triglyceride form. But unfortunately, if it is in triglyceride form, there are other components of that kind of glycerol backbone, etc. Anyway, we don't need to get into that. So go onto labdoor.com, see if your brand is any good, and if it's not, switch out to a better brand. And again, like Gary said, like I'm taking like 3 to 5 grams. Well, I'm taking like 3 grams of actual omega-3s with usually about 25% spread to DHA and 75% towards EPA. Now, I do have ADHD. DHA is actually beneficial for ADHD. So I actually don't mind getting a little bit more DHA in the diet. But if I wasn't and I was only thinking about heart disease risk, I'd be just prioritizing EPA, because for some people, DHA does actually raise their triglycerides, which is, converse to what most people want in terms of, general health. But again, it's the risk to reward stuff there with that. We actually might do an episode on just fish oils in general. But anyway, that's it for now. But I will also say that I personally consume like 3 to 4 servings of fish per week. Generally speaking, I do have some sort of fish. Like I know we usually have like salmon, some sort of salmon dish at least once per week. And then generally, if we're out and about, I'll probably get sushi somewhere. If we're out and about and I'm like, oh, I want to get something for lunch, I'll probably get some sort of like salmon and cream cheese sandwich or something. Like I just enjoy fish, and I know I said salmon like fucking 4 times there, but other fish as well, like especially cold water fatty fish, like I like fish, so I eat it enough throughout the week to kind of ensure that I am getting enough omega-3s throughout the week, which is again a benefit of fats in terms of you don't need to consume them every single day. Like your body does store them. It's not like, protein, although you do store protein in the form of muscles and in your, your amino acids in your general like stomach cavity. But you can kind of store fatty acids for longer.
Check. Yeah, that's omega-3s. I'm happy with that.
Yeah. Anything else with the diet that we're considering? So we've got, again, we're eating enough fiber. We're reducing our saturated fat intake. Maybe you want to talk about saturated fat a little bit more. We're eating sufficient protein. We're eating a sufficient calorie diet. We're getting our omega-3s. Anything else with the diet? Like obviously, again, like we could spend all day here thinking, oh, this is the exact thing we're doing. This is, potentially beneficial here. But we're generally just eating enough fruit and veg that covers a lot of our bases. We're eating some, good quality meats that again covers a lot of our bases. Like, yeah, we could go into like, oh, you want to consume organ meats, you want to get some liver in there, has a lot of like, choline, it has a lot of these other beneficial, whatever. But I don't think we need to go too much down the rabbit hole with that. But do you want to say anything else on that, or do you want to talk a little bit more about saturated fat?
Yeah, I think the only other thing I suppose that would be a specific component of the food matrix would be things like polyphenols. If you're eating lots of fruits and vegetables, you're probably taking care of this, but in particular, dark berries, like blueberries or dark chocolate as well. It's typically like those kind of richer foods that are naturally rich in color slash flavor. They're the things that tend to contribute a lot to your polyphenol content. Also things like olive oil and lots of other fruits. Okay, so polyphenol content in particular for Alzheimer's slash cognitive decline long term is something that is a good idea. You'll hear sometimes people from the kind of ancestral keto community being like, oh, these polyphenols are not essential. But the reality is that, like, when we're thinking about these questions of Alzheimer's disease risk long term, for example, we're thinking really about like optimizing. Like that's what we're doing. We're saying, how can we preserve our cognitive function into late life? So when you're thinking about like what's essential in the diet, you're thinking about like what's required to just keep me alive, keep me ticking over. But that's not what we're aiming at. We're aiming at living long and being able to preserve our quality of life long term as well. So often it's these non-essential components of the diet that actually end up being potentially beneficial for our long-term health span. So within your fruit and vegetable intake, if you're getting like dark berries in there, boom, like you're nailing that. And I think that that's probably enough for most people to be starting to contribute to their polyphenol content in the diet long term, along with their overall fruit and vegetable intake. Maybe drizzling a bit of olive oil on salads every now and then. That's something that might be beneficial. But then your saturated fat intake as well is something that you do want to consider. And again, this kind of comes back to what we said earlier, where if you're following the rest of the kind of dietary recommendations, you're probably taking care of this to some degree, because what you often see with saturated fat intake is that people begin to rack it up when they start to consume lots of processed food. So for example, let's say you have a couple of muffins or a load of cookies in the evening or something, and suddenly you've gotten like 20 grams of saturated fat through all the added butter that you just didn't even realize. It's not like you're layering butter on your meals, but it's coming through these indirect sources. So that's often the case. So if you're taking care of like reducing your processed food intake, not eating loads of junk, when you're eating out, you're making smart choices, you've probably taken care of most of that. And all you need to do on top of that really is just, cook with unsaturated oil sources. If you're instead of butter, for example, if you're cooking lots of meals with some sort of cooking fat, that's something that you can do. Um, if you're having, 6 slices of toast a day, you're not lathering them all in butter, swap it out for peanut butter or something else, or even just half and half, something along those lines, then you'll be in a good place. But they're the types of things that you want to be considering. You want to look at your diet as a whole and then ask yourself, what's actually contributing to my saturated fat intake personally? Because what you might see is that you're getting in maybe 8 to 10% of total calories from saturated fat. It's coming from your olive oil, your salmon, your peanut butter, things that you didn't even consider as saturated fat sources, but they're just indirect contributors. So for you, you don't need to reduce further. You're not likely to benefit very much from reducing further. And viewing the problem with viewing like saturated fat as an inherently bad thing that should be totally avoided is that you end up avoiding foods that have other beneficial properties, such as, for example, dairy intake contributing to your calcium, your vitamin D, your protein intake, etc. If you,
Red meat and iron.
yeah, red meat and iron. What else is there that's within saturated fat rich foods? We mentioned already dark chocolate, for example. You're getting polyphenols, you're getting theobromine, you're getting other benefits from that dark chocolate that are beneficial for vascular health and potentially for cognitive health long term, that if you were to look solely at the saturated fat intake, you might end up missing out on it. Okay. So if you're having a bit of dark chocolate here and there, the odd time you have a bit of butter on your toast, there's some saturated fat in your salmon, there's some saturated fat in your nuts, there's some saturated fat in your olive oil. They're not the things you need to be worried about. It's more so that if you're really starting to take your fat sources, bump them in the direction of the saturated fat direction, and then your overall fat intake on top of that is composing a large quantity of the diet, then that starts to become a bit more important. So the people who really need to worry about their specific fat sources in a little bit more detail are those who already have a very high fat diet. So if you have a high carbohydrate, low fat diet, you're eating lots of fruits and vegetables, lots of fiber, you're not really adding fat to much of your meals. Even if you're adding a bit of saturated fat there, like it's probably not adding to much of a risk really, because the overall intake is still low. Whereas you could have someone who's on a very low carbohydrate, very high fat diet, let's say 60, 70% from fat of their calories. And even if they're trying to choose unsaturated sources most of the time, they could still be accumulating a lot of saturated fat just through those indirect sources with very minimal from those more direct sources. So for the person who is on a low carb, high fat diet, pay more attention to it. If you're on a higher carb, lower fat diet, you probably need to pay less attention to it, provided you're taking care of all the other recommendations. So I think that's a fair summary for the purpose of this episode anyway.
100%. And the only thing I'll add to that, well, two things is we probably just want to avoid trans fats in general.
Yes, for sure.
Now, that's fortunate enough in terms of like most things, they're trying to lower their trans fat intake anyway. Like, most things you buy, unless it's like fucking, I don't know, cookies or something, like probably have very low trans fat anyway. So it's not a huge concern unless, again, you have a hugely processed diet. So lower your trans fats if you are eating a lot of trans fats. But on top of that, this is one of those things where I actually think it's kind of against what we generally recommend, because we don't generally recommend a lot of like blood testing or anything like that. Your cholesterol, really easy marker to just get tested. Do it once a year, every second year, whatever, and see where it's at. And then you can be like, okay, this is where my diet is currently bringing my blood cholesterol levels or my blood lipids, and then all of a sudden you can be like, okay, I need to make a change, right? And the thing about it is, and this is the thing you'll find if you do go out and research this stuff, is that the research is pretty clear, but when you actually talk to people that are in the field, they have differing opinions of how changes you should make or what numbers you should be looking at. The one thing I will say on that is, don't move the goalpost. Don't be like, okay, well, 3 is the cutoff. And then you have like other, modifying factors where you're like, oh, well, I have, a lot of antioxidants in the diet, or I got to fucking coronary calcium score and it was fine, don't move the goalposts. Just be like, okay, well, if you want to have good general, like, cholesterol levels, we probably want that LDL at least below 3, right? So that's something to consider. Go out and get a blood test. You can go to your doctor. You can go to something like Let's Get Checked. Like, we have a discount code for Let's Get Checked of Triage 20 if you want to use that. But just getting your blood lipids tested, really fucking simple intervention. And at least then you know where you're at with your cholesterol level, and then where your diet is actually, trending you. Because unfortunately, again, this is one of those things where, you're laying down the foundation of this stuff now, and it's probably not going to affect you until you're 40, 50, 60, whatever, right? So the sooner you can get this sorted, the better, right? And it's not that expensive to get your cholesterol tested, right? Which kind of brings me to the next thing, which I'm actually skipping over a few things to get to this, which is just your general hormonal health. I know a lot of people like to really focus in on this and be like, oh, I want to optimize my testosterone level, blah, blah, blah. But the best thing about this is, or the really good thing about this is, your hormonal health is just a general picture into your overall general health, right? Like, your body is at its best when it's at its best, right? So if you are doing everything right in terms of looking after your body, your hormonal health is going to be in a good place, right? For the vast majority of people, unless there is an actual issue there. So you can just go out and get a blood test and, measure your testosterone, or measure like your female sex hormones or whatever. And that'll give you a picture in terms of how your recovery is going, how your general diet is going, like what's actually happening under the hood. Outside of that, I actually don't think it's that effective to get like hormones measured, because they change every single day, unless obviously you're on some sort of anabolics, like, you're in TRT, even like your blood serum concentration is pretty stable because it's got that constant bleed from the injection, rather than like you having to produce it every single day, right? But it gives you a window into like, oh, how is my sleep? If you're not sleeping enough, you're not going to be optimally producing testosterone, right? If you're not eating enough, you're not going to be optimally producing enough testosterone. So it gives you that kind of general picture into what's going on. And again, really simple blood test to do. Again, you don't have to do it necessarily. Like, I think it's probably good to do it every once in a while, at least to have a picture, especially if you're in your like 20s or something, at least to have an idea of like, oh, this is when I felt great. This is where my hormones were at. At least you know that when you're in your like 50s or 60s and you're like, oh, I actually am considering going on TRT or something. At least you know where you used to be at. Do you have anything to say on that, Gary?
On check and test, yeah. If anyone higher test than me, you can win a prize, because mine is the Chad. I'm only joking. Anyway, testosterone, yeah, look, it is something that if you're interested, you can check it. The reality is that it's one of those things that it's fairly unlikely to be significantly low unless you've got like multiple different symptoms. Like, most people listening to this podcast who are, as Patty said, taking care of the basic, health recommendations, it would be surprising for you to have low testosterone. It's probably fine. I think people are often very keen to check it because they think, oh my God, if it's low, one, I have an excuse for why I'm not making progress. And two, I might get prescribed TRT, which would be great because gains, So look, there's obviously a strong incentive for people to check it. Just make sure that when you're getting blood tests like that, if you're going to get blood tests like that, that you recognize that the physiological range is, it's fairly broad. I think it's what, 300 to 900 to 300 to 1,000 is the broad physiological range. And whether you're 900 or whether you're 300 or 400, there's not actually a massive difference in outcomes in terms of like muscle building, for example. So it's not like optimizing from 500 to 700 is actually going to make a difference in terms of your outcomes with muscle building or fat loss. Because the other thing is that like testosterone levels are like very variable depending on diurnal rhythm, so across the day, but also like, how have you been sleeping the last few days? What are your nutrition been like recently, etc. One of the things that you could do is, if you want to get prescribed TRT, this isn't a recommendation, is go into an aggressive calorie deficit for a month, sleep deprive yourself, and then go in and get your testosterone.
Drink a little bit of alcohol as well.
Drink a lot of alcohol. And then you go in and your testosterone's super low, and your doctor's like, hold on, you're like 100 kilos shredded. How did this happen? You're like, I don't know. I haven't been able to make any progress. Doc, give me some tests. So that can happen. But no, in all seriousness, that's just to illustrate the point that you have to be able to interpret these tests in context. And if you're looking at a test that's, you're in 50% or you're in the total average range, it's not like getting up to 75% or 90% or the 90th centile is going to make a significant difference. I am case in point. My testosterone is above the natural range. It's right above the kind of normal physiological range. And, do I know that that's like that all the time? I haven't a clue. I got it tested at one point. I haven't got it retested since. I don't want it, to be honest, because I'm just happy with that number. So I just placebo myself. But like, am I absolutely jacked out of my mind?
No.
No. I was kind of, waiting for effect there. Thought I might say yes, but look, I'm not going to fool myself. I'm 86 kilos, is pretty soaking wet. I'm not jacked out of my mind. And when I train consistently, even like I definitely don't get above average results from the efforts I put in. I don't think. I definitely wouldn't consider myself genetically gifted, because the thing is, your normal level of testosterone, it's not making a significant impact on your outcomes. But the other thing there as well is that, and this is often overlooked, because again, things that are difficult to measure are often overlooked, and that's your level of testosterone within the blood, whether it's free or bound or whatever. When we measure those things, that still doesn't tell us what's happening at the level of the receptor. So you can have various levels of androgen receptor density or response to that testosterone. That's just, we can't measure. Like, I don't know what my level of androgen sensitivity is. I could be totally or very, very low percentile there in terms of the androgen receptor density in my pecs, for example, but still have super high testosterone. Someone else could have lower testosterone and very high receptor density. So these are just difficult to measure. And as a result, it's not worth stressing too much over levels within the physiological range.
Yeah, and this is why like bodybuilders take multiple drugs. Like, say, for example, like they could be taking thyroid, which increases androgen receptor density. Yeah. It's like, oh, cool, I'll just do these two things. Now they're fucking synergistic, right? But again, I still think it is, valuable to occasionally, like, however, it depends on the individual, obviously, occasionally get hormones tested. For example, me, like, I don't really drink coffee anymore. And that's purely because from my testing on myself, I've found out that coffee raises my cholesterol. And then also that coffee, not caffeine, raises my sex hormone binding globulin, right? So like, that's just specific to me. I would never have known that unless I got testing. But also, like, it's not like I went to a doctor and he figured that out for me. Like, I had to figure that stuff out myself. And I'm not confident that, the average person would be able to figure that stuff out. So it's very hard to recommend just general testing, because it's very hard to interpret blood tests. Like, it's not like it's like, here's your user guide of this is what this exactly means, because as Gary said, you have to take into account all of the context of that individual, their lifestyle, all the different parameters, and then look at the blood test. And you might not have complete information then as well, So I think it is valuable, but again, I wouldn't be putting too much stock in, a random blood test that you took on a fucking random Thursday morning, But moving on from that, unless you want to say anything else about hormonal health, no, recovery modalities, we kind of touched on this a few times, like sleep. The two of us would ideally sleep 8 to 9 hours. I know I get nice 8 hours these days, but this is probably an area that you trade off a bit, Gary. You're probably not getting the 8 hours. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, certainly not all the time. It's sometimes at the weekend I'll be able to get that, but on average, I'm definitely getting, like, I get my 7 hours sometimes. Sometimes I'll let it drop lower to 6 hours or so. I definitely feel the difference for sure. But yeah, you just have to apply this within the context of your own life. If you're taking on a lot more than the average person in terms of work, studies, etc., you might, for a given period of your life or a given period of time. Another obvious example is, when you've had kids and they're young, you might just have to accept that as a trade-off. That might be something that actually is still a net positive for your health long term. For example, if you're sacrificing a bit of sleep for 5 years, but the benefit of that is that you're financially stable long term, that could potentially still be a net positive versus someone who's financially unstable but well slept, because we know that those psychosocial and socioeconomic factors are incredibly important for health long term as well. So for me, I view this as a trade-off that I'm probably not going to be accepting forever. I expect that in the future I'll be able to rest my 8 to 9 hours at some point, especially later into my life, that I'll be, relaxed and stable and secure, etc. But for now, I'm accepting that I have to get up a bit earlier than maybe I'd like to, and go to bed a bit earlier than I'd like to, or sometimes stay up a bit later than I'd like to, in order to facilitate my lifestyle. But I still do my absolute best to get over 7 hours, which is kind of the point that if you look at the research, like 7 hours seems to be that sweet spot in terms of the peak benefit of getting more sleep. Now, with that said, that's probably not the same for athletes, and there might be some variance there. But if you can get 7 hours and it's good quality sleep, and I mean 7 hours asleep, not in bed, you're doing very, very, very well, I would say, if you're getting that 7 hours consistently. Getting over that, probably a good idea. Getting 8 to 9, if you're a serious athlete, probably a good idea, and sometimes even more. That'd be my recommendation.
100%. So yeah, if you can get your 8 to 9 hours, fantastic. If you are staying up late to just watch, I don't know, fucking Netflix or something, and as a result of that, you're getting 6 hours of sleep, like that's probably going to be one of the significant habits that you look back on your life and go, fuck me, that was actually taking away from my life. Now, obviously, again, we do have to factor in, like, the time you watch Netflix with your partner at the end of the day or whatever it is, that obviously has a role in your life overall, especially if you have kids or whatever. And it's like the last hour before you go to bed, it's the only time you and your partner have to just like wind down together, relax. Fine, whatever. Again, this is all about trade-offs. It's all about like, how much is this giving to me versus how much is this taking away from me, maybe in the next couple of years or at the end of your life, like, I don't know. Again, you have to weigh up those risks yourself, right? There's a few other things that I wouldn't mind covering, but we can kind of go through them a little bit fast. Supplements, Gary, is there anything that you use in particular that you're like, this is something that's beneficial for most people? And like, I know obviously there's time periods where you're like, oh, I might use this supplement for this reason, or you might use, like, I don't know, something to help with your cholesterol. You might be trialing something out for a client. You might be like, I've actually never used that, let me see how that works, whatever. But other than like a multivitamin, there's nothing that I would just generically recommend. Like, I personally, I take a multivitamin every day. I use the Thorne brand, and they have like a two per day supplement. I only take one because my general diet is pretty good, and it's kind of just nutritional insurance for any little, like, random micronutrient that I didn't get enough of that day. I am also an advocate, like fish oil and a multivitamin. I'm an advocate of just spending a little bit more on those and getting a higher quality one. Like, well, yeah, you're probably getting a good, general spread of nutrients from this generic, multivitamin you pick up in Tesco or whatever. It's probably not the most beneficial, the most cost effective. So while, yeah, you are getting some of those nutrients, and that's obviously a benefit, like, is it doing exactly what you want it to do? It's hard to say. And would you be better off just spending that little bit more money and actually getting the benefits? Again, that's the risk to reward ratio that you have to figure out for yourself. And again, you can go onto all these like third-party testing sites and see if like the multivitamin you're using is any good. But other than a multivitamin, Gary, do you have anything to say in terms of supplements that you'd be like, yeah, most people should take this? I should actually say I do also take like a psyllium husk, because I think like that's pretty fucking beneficial. Like, I take like 10 grams of it a day. That's really beneficial for my cholesterol. At least that always consistently keeps it below that kind of 2. If I'm taking 5 to 10 grams of psyllium husk a day, I mix that in with a like greens powder, which again is just kind of nutritional insurance for me. But other than that, there's nothing that I'd be like, yeah, like most people should be taking it.
Yeah, maybe vitamin D in the winter is something that's potentially useful. Now, with that said, this does kind of vary by by your actual location as well. So there is an app I think Brian uses. I don't know the name of it. I think there's,
D-minder.
what is it?
D-minder.
D-minder. Yeah, and that's I think, what does it show you? It shows you the amount of, you go through it there.
Yeah, it shows you basically where you are, wherever country, location, whatever, whether you're actually able to get vitamin D from the sun at that, latitude or
Yeah.
longitude, whatever it is in the sky anyway, wherever the sun is at that time of year, etc. Like you might find that like, oh yeah, I'm out getting sun exposure, but it's actually not at a sufficient quantity to actually produce vitamin D in your body. Like I actually do take vitamin D. I should have said that. Like I just take 5,000 IU per day. Like I've got my blood tested before, and that just kept me in the range. So unless I'm out like getting significant sun during the summer, like I don't really change that. But yeah,
Sweet. Yeah, I think it tells you the time of day as well if you want to
yeah,
turn
like
on.
it tells you, like it literally will be like, right, where is the sun right now for
Yeah.
you? Are you actually getting enough vitamin D if you were to go out for like a walk in this? I haven't used it in years. Like I used it about 5 years ago, so I'm sure it's updated and stuff. But you used to be able to like put in how much clothes you're wearing as well. Like, are you walking around like shirtless? Are you walking around in like speedos? Like, and it would tell you like, okay, based on this surface area of your body being exposed, you're probably getting X amount, or you would need this much sun exposure to get whatever amount, And especially like we live in the British Isles, and although I like to say the Atlantic archipelago, like we're not getting a fucking huge amount of sunlight. We're not getting a huge amount of vitamin D producing sunlight for the vast majority of the year, unfortunately. So it probably does make sense to consume some sort of vitamin D.
Yeah. Check. And likewise there, like if you're concerned about that and you're like, oh, I don't want to be taking a supplement if I don't need it, or I don't want to be exposing myself to the risk of toxicity or whatever, you can just check your levels. Very simple. Like last time I checked my vitamin D, it was, more than I would require, a very good level. So I don't take it every day. I take it every now and then. And if I get my levels retested and I see that, oh, they've dropped a bit, I'll increase the frequency, So rather than just guessing and just spending your money, it is something that you can just get checked if required. It's a fairly inexpensive blood test, I think.
Fantastic. So is there any other supplements that you would recommend, or are there any other like
I
general
don't think
health
so,
practices
honestly.
you need?
Yeah, I don't think so, to be honest. I don't think there's anything that I take for health. Maybe creatine, you could say, is something that's potentially beneficial for your health as well. Long term, definitely beneficial for performance. So maybe we put that in there. No, I don't think there's anything else really that I nothing I supplement with consistently that would be, for health purposes anyway.
Yeah, and see, this is the thing. Like, there probably are supplements that we take either occasionally or whatever, where we're like, oh yeah, actually, we're working towards this. Like, you could argue, excuse me, that something like citrulline malate, fantastic for blood pressure. Like, you could argue that, right? But am I taking it for that? No. I probably just take some citrulline malate before a workout because helps with a pump, right? The only other thing in terms of general health practices that I would occasionally do is I do some intermittent fasting, like twice per week. I don't really consider that like a hugely beneficial health practice, but I might get some benefit from it. In 20 years time, like maybe it has given me some benefit. Generally I just do it because I don't train on the days that I do it, and I'm just like, I'd rather just eat a little bit more later on in the day rather than having this like focus of like eating a huge meal in the morning. So that's just me. I don't know if you do any occasional fasting, Gary.
Every now and then, it's kind of something I go through phases of, but not at the moment, or not recently anyway. Sometimes by accident, but not deliberately.
Yeah. So that's pretty much it. Like, we could talk about like, potential drugs that we would be like, yeah, these are beneficial to take. Like, the only ones that I'd be like, yeah, look, this could actually, if you're talking about population wide, this is maybe beneficial, would be something like a statin. But even then I'd be like, look, just get your blood tested, eat enough fiber, eat the diet recommendations that we're talking about in terms of saturated fat. And you probably maybe don't need a statin.
Yeah, check.
Anyway, do you have anything else to say to kind of wrap this episode up, or anything else that you're like, oh, we should have covered that or whatever?
I think that covers most things. Like lads, if you're doing all that stuff, God, you're doing like super, super well, for God's sake. If you're doing all that I would start putting my energy into other places first. Okay. Think of what has the potential to impact my health in 50 years, there's so many different things, like some of the things that people wouldn't even think of, like getting health insurance, so that you don't end up having to remortgage your house because you got sick or something like that. There are such simple things that actually do definitely matter longer term, especially
or stuff like, again, like getting more education so you can make more money, so that you are in a whatever higher socioeconomic status, and as a result of that, you're actually able to afford the better quality meat or the better quality supplements or whatever, and like that stuff is obviously outside the scope of this podcast, but all of those things do actually pay dividend in terms of your health. And it's
100%.
unfortunate to say, because it's not like people who are poor don't deserve better health, but it's unfortunate that a lot of this stuff just costs money or time, so you're unfortunately going to have to put that into it. And if you have more money available to you, you're like whatever, making 200K per year, you're probably going to end up being healthier by virtue of the fact that you can pay someone to do your diet out. You can pay someone to, or you can pay to get better supplements, or you can do whatever because you're making more money. So even though, again, it's outside the scope of this podcast, having more money does improve your health, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I mean, like long term, that actually is something that is even worth considering at our age, because like, if you don't have a pension, let's say, set up with your employer, and you're just going to rely on the state pension, then that's something you might want to negotiate, set up yourself, etc. Start saving, stop spending all of your paycheck every single week and being in debt, etc. Easier said than done, I know, but there's definitely plenty of people listening to this podcast that could be putting that into practice. That is something that will make a difference long term, because you don't realize that, like, when you're 70, 80 and you start to lose your function, you now need to install a walk-in shower downstairs, or have a downstairs bedroom, etc. All these things that actually require lots of money, that could end your life in a second if not put in. Because if you have, especially, I don't know if this is, it's obviously not just an Irish thing, but my old bath that I used to have, like, I remember even as a kid, like stepping up into the bath would be, a big.
In my bath, man, it's literally like up to my waist, and I'm tall, like.
Exactly, that's exactly it. Like, you have to take a big massive step in over, and if you're 70 or 80, like, you can't do that, and all it takes is you slip, you fracture your hip, you're in hospital, you get a respiratory infection, and now you're dead. And that was what killed you after all your efforts, all the years. So putting a bit of money away every now and then for that stuff, I know most people won't listen to that because it sounds ridiculous when you're our age, but it matters.
Yeah, like I couldn't tell you the amount of people that I've encouraged to get a pension and have got a pension as a result of that. But like, again, it makes sense.
Yeah.
The more financially secure you are, probably the better health you're going to have throughout your lifespan, and that even goes down to like stress, like this is one of those things which are like, it's uncounted deaths related to like financial crises or crises, whatever, right? Like, say even like the coronavirus, all this stuff, like you're going to find now in the next 5, 10, 15 years, they're going to start counting up like the extra cancer deaths because, people didn't have the financial means to go out and, get testing or whatever because, they lost their job, or like all those kind of things. So like, the more financially secure you are, the kind of the better position you are in from a health perspective. And again, as I said, it's unfortunate because it's not like poor people don't deserve better health. And we are fortunate in the countries that we live in that there is at least some sort of fallback in terms of like healthcare services that are, free at the point of contact anyway, or point of whatever. And then also you have like whatever it is, the dole and stuff. Now, are they, going to get you rich? No, but at least there is some sort of fallback for, keeping you healthy, keeping you, living your life. But again, that kind of goes beyond the scope of this podcast, even though we have talked about that stuff before in previous episodes and stuff. But anyway, Gary, to wrap this up, do you have anything else that you'd like to say in terms of health? Because this is the episode, again, it was kind of just a little bit of a, like, these are some of the things we're thinking about with, health and stuff. We probably will do a general health series on all of these different things and go through like, okay, like we did it with like obesity, we did it with the heart disease stuff, but we'll probably go through like, okay, here's exactly what we do with these various diseases or whatever. This is just kind of a quick episode, even though it went on for quite long.
No, I think that's everything for now. Anyway, I'm happy.
Fantastic. So where can people find us?
Yeah. So number one, guys, obviously, if you're interested in coaching, do get in touch. We're coming towards the new year now. So if you're interested in working with us, please do apply ASAP so that we can get you on a call, discuss the process, and allocate you to the coach that you would like to work with or that will be the best fit for you. So get in touch ASAP. Other than that, you can follow along with everything that we're doing by following us on social media. That's the best thing you can do. Follow Triage Method on Instagram and Facebook as your priority number one. You can also follow the YouTube channel where we put out excerpts from our podcast episodes. Some of the clips might be of more interest than the full episodes. So that's something that people have been finding quite useful. And follow the individual coaches as well by going to the Triage Method Instagram, click on the following section, and then you'll see all of our coaches there as we all put out individual content on our pages as well. That's likely to be of benefit to you if you like the podcast. If you do like the podcast, you can also share it on your story. You can leave a rating and review if your app allows, and recommend it to a friend. And we really appreciate that as always.
Fantastic. Anyway, guys, we will see you in the next one.